When Margaret Sullivan walked into that elementary school classroom for the last time, she had no idea the police were already on their way. 53 years as a teacher, 53 years of shaping young minds. And it would all end in handcuffs, but what the officers found in her desk drawer that afternoon wasn't what anyone expected. Margaret had taught second grade in rural Pennsylvania since 1971. She'd seen 8 presidents come and go. She'd taught 3 generations of the same families. Parents who were once her students now brought their own children to her classroom. Everyone in town knew Mrs. Sullivan, the woman with the gentle smile and infinite patience, the teacher who stayed late to help struggling readers, the one who bought winter coats for kids who needed them. She never married, never had children of her own. The classroom was her family. Those 23 desks were her whole world. On the morning of October 12th, everything seemed normal. Margaret arrived at 6:30 like always. She arranged the day's materials. She wrote the date on the board in perfect cursive. She set out construction paper for the afternoon art project. The children arrived at 8. Backpacks thumping against small bodies, voices echoing in the hallway, 23 second graders tumbling into room 104. They didn't notice anything different. Mrs. Sullivan seemed the same as always, calm, present, ready to teach. Yeah, but something was different. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she took attendance. Her voice caught when she said good morning. She kept glancing at the clock. At 9:15, the principal's voice crackled over the intercom. "Mrs. Sullivan, please send your students to the library for reading time." The children gathered their books. They lined up at the door. Margaret watched them file out, each small face passing by. Tommy with the gap-toothed grin, Emma, who always wore purple, Carlos, who struggled with his letters but never gave up. She memorized every detail, as if she might never see them again, because she wouldn't. 10 minutes later, Principal Hayes entered the classroom. 2 police officers stood behind him. Margaret was sitting at her desk, perfectly still, waiting. "Mrs. Sullivan," Hayes said quietly, "we need to talk about what you've been doing." She didn't deny anything, didn't try to explain. She simply stood up, opened her desk drawer, and pulled out a composition notebook. "This is everything," she said, her voice steady now. "Calm. All of it." The officers exchanged glances. They'd been told to expect evidence of embezzlement. The school board had discovered irregularities in the classroom supply budget, thousands of dollars unaccounted for over the past 5 years. Margaret Sullivan had been stealing from the school. At least that's what the financial audit suggested. But when Officer Martinez opened that composition notebook, he found something completely different. Page after page of names, dates, dollar amounts, detailed records spanning 5 years. But these weren't records of theft. They were records of giving. Jamal Henderson, November 2020, winter coat and boots, $78. The Ramirez twins, September 2021, school supplies and backpacks, $1T2. Keisha Thompson, March 2022, prescription glasses, $215. On and on. Hundreds of entries, thousands of dollars. Margaret had been using her own retirement savings to buy things her students needed, things their families couldn't afford. She'd been doing it quietly, secretly, for years. But here's what nobody knew yet. The reason she was being investigated. The reason police had been called. It wasn't about the money Margaret had spent. It was about the money she'd been accused of taking. Someone had reported her. Someone claimed she'd been stealing from the petty cash fund, falsifying receipts, pocketing money meant for classroom supplies. The accusation came from Jennifer Walsh, a newer teacher. Ambitious, competitive, Jennifer wanted Margaret's classroom. Room 1004 had the best windows, the most space. It was the prestigious second grade assignment, and Margaret had held it for decades. So Jennifer started paying attention. She noticed Margaret buying things for students. She saw the worn clothes Margaret wore. The same 3 dresses rotated throughout the week. The sensible shoes with holes in the soles. Jennifer assumed Margaret was poor, struggling, maybe desperate enough to steal. She reported her suspicions to the principal. An investigation was launched. The audit revealed significant discrepancies. Money was definitely missing from the supply budget, but it wasn't what it looked like. Officer Martinez closed the notebook. He looked at Margaret. "This doesn't explain the missing school funds," he said gently. Margaret nodded. "I know," she replied. "That was me too." The room went silent. I was taking money from the supply budget, she continued. Small amounts, $20 here, $50 there. I'd submit fake receipts to cover it. Hayes looked stricken. Margaret, why? Because my retirement savings ran out last year. Her voice cracked slightly. But the kids still needed things, and I couldn't just stop helping them. The truth spilled out. Margaret lived on a teacher's salary that hadn't kept pace with inflation. She'd never bought a house, never traveled, never spent money on herself. Everything went to her students. When her modest retirement account was depleted, she started borrowing from the school's petty cash, always intending to pay it back. Never quite able to. The total she'd taken was $3,200. The total she'd spent on students was $47,000. Officer Martinez sat down heavily. You spend $47,000 of your own money? Margaret shrugged. What else was I going to do with it? But that's when the truly shocking part emerged. Principal Hayes was looking through the notebook more carefully. He stopped on a page from 2019. Margaret, he said slowly, this entry here. Diabetes medication for unnamed student, $850 monthly. For 3 years, that's over $30,000 alone. Who was this student? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I can't say. You have to. The family didn't want anyone to know. They were undocumented, couldn't get insurance. Their daughter was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Without insulin, she would die. So I bought it every month for 3 years until they were able to get proper documentation. The girl is in high school now. She's thriving. That's all that matters. Hayes put his head in his hands. The officer stood there, uncertain. Technically, Margaret had committed a crime, embezzlement, theft. The law was clear, but so was her intent. Officer Martinez made a decision. He pulled out his phone, made a call. Within an hour, the local news had the story. By that evening, it had gone national. Teacher steals from school to buy insulin for undocumented student. Veteran educator faces charges for helping children. The response was immediate, overwhelming. Within 24 hours, a GoFundMe was created. The goal was to repay the school and support Margaret. It raised $3,000 in the first hour, $30,000 by the end of the day. By the end of the week, it exceeded 2 million. People from every state contributed. Teachers who understood, parents who were grateful, strangers who were moved by Margaret's quiet dedication. The comments told their own story. I was one of Mrs. Sullivan's students in 1984, wrote a woman from Pittsburgh. She bought me winter boots when mine fell apart. I never forgot her kindness. My son was in her class last year, wrote a current parent. She spent hours after school helping him read, never asked for anything. Now I know why she always looked so tired. The school board held an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously not to press charges. They returned Margaret to her classroom. They established a fund to help teachers support students in need. But Margaret did something unexpected. She announced her retirement. After 53 years, she was done, not because of the investigation, not because of the publicity, but because she was exhausted. Teaching had changed. The needs had grown, the resources had shrunk. She'd spent her entire adult life trying to fill the gaps, and she simply couldn't do it anymore. Her final day was December 18th. 200 people gathered in the school gymnasium. Former students flew in from across the country, adults in their 30s, 40s, 50s, all shaped by this one woman. They told stories about the time Mrs. Sullivan noticed a student was hungry and kept granola bars in her desk, about how she taught a shy girl to believe in herself, about the Christmas she dressed as Santa and delivered presents to students' homes, about the countless small kindnesses that added up to change lives. Tommy, the boy with the gap-toothed grin, now a dentist in Philadelphia, spoke. Mrs. Sullivan taught me to read, he said, but more than that, she taught me I was worth the effort. Nobody had ever made me feel that way before. Emma, who always wore purple, now a teacher herself, brought her own second-grade class. They sang a song they'd written for Mrs. Sullivan. Every child in that room understood. This was what teaching looked like when you actually cared. The ceremony ended with a surprise. The community had pooled resources. They bought Margaret something she'd never had, a home, a small house on a quiet street, fully paid for. Margaret cried, not because of the house, though that was overwhelming, but because after a lifetime of giving, people were finally giving back. She moved into the house in January. She filled it with books and photographs of students, thousands of faces spanning 5 decades. Every single one remembered. She volunteers now, At the library, at the food bank, at the literacy center, she still helps children, still gives everything she has, but the story doesn't end there. Because something remarkable happened. Teachers across the country started speaking up about the money they spent from their own pockets, about the impossible choices they faced daily, about the children slipping through cracks while the world looked away. Margaret's story became a catalyst for conversations about teacher pay, about funding for schools, about how we support the most vulnerable children. Legislation was proposed, the Margaret Sullivan Act, federal funding to ensure no teacher has to choose between helping a student and paying their own bills. It passed, not because politicians suddenly cared more, but because Margaret's story made it impossible to ignore. You cannot look at a 75-year-old woman who gave everything and say the system is working. You cannot see $47,000 spent from a teacher's pocket and claim schools have adequate resources. You cannot watch a child almost die because their family couldn't afford insulin and pretend everything is fine. Margaret changed that conversation, not through grand gestures or loud demands, but through 53 years of quiet, relentless compassion. She's 80 now, still sharp, still engaged, still showing up. The girl whose insulin she'd bought for 3 years was graduating, valedictorian, full scholarship to medical school. In her speech, the girl thanked her parents, her teachers, and one person she didn't name. But she looked directly at Margaret when she said it. "Someone once saved my life without me even knowing. They never asked for recognition. They just did what needed to be done. I hope to spend my life doing the same." The crowd didn't know who she was talking about, but Margaret knew, and that was enough, because that's who Margaret Sullivan is, someone who does what needs to be done, without fanfare, without expectation of reward, just because children need help and she has help to give. That's the real story, not the investigation, not the accusations, not even the vindication. It's about one woman's choice to see children as human beings worthy of investment, even when that investment cost everything she had. We need more Margaret Sullivans, more people who look at broken systems and decide to be the solution, even imperfectly, more humans who understand that compassion isn't just a feeling, it's an action, a choice, made every single day. Margaret would tell you she didn't do anything special. She'd say any teacher would have done the same. But that's not true, not because teachers don't care, but because the system makes caring this much nearly impossible. Margaret did it anyway, for 53 years, and the ripples of that decision are still spreading, in the doctors and teachers and parents who were once her students, in the legislation that bears her name, in the children who will never know how close they came to falling through the cracks, until someone decided they mattered enough to catch. That's the power of one person who refuses to look away, who sees a need and fills it, who understands that sometimes the right thing costs everything, and chooses to pay that price anyway. Margaret Sullivan, a teacher, a thief, a hero, all three are true, and all three matter. If this story moved you, take a second to like and subscribe.